And you may recall from the session we did 2 weeks ago, if you were here or saw the recording, that I was still in like sort of teacher mode. I needed to give a presentation and explain more of the context. It seemed like what's going on in Barichara is very complex. So there was this need to give presentation and to create a rich context. And today I did not prepare a presentation because I wanted to have this feel more like a work group where we can have collaborative conversations and we can imagine things together. So the question would be, if anyone needs more context on what's going on in Barichara, I can be more elaborate, or else I can just give a brief update. But what I'd really like to do is set some context for us to start practicing um, how we design these financial processes as they relate to bioregional regeneration. And maybe just as a bit more context, so this is like the sneak preview of what we'll be sharing in the design school soon, is that in September, we're going to start a 1 year-long focus on creating bioregional funding ecosystems. And that Penny and I actually have $150,000 that we will be bringing into 4 different bioregions associated with the design school to give them as seed funding that they can give into their communities to start building these funding ecosystems. And so in September, we'll soon be announcing that at the last week of September, there's going to be a design immersion in the greater Takaranto bioregion to kick this off, to start building the funding ecosystem there with Brian and Susan of the Legacy Project. And we have plans for another immersion that will take place in Barichara in February. And then there'll be another one in Cascadia and another one in the Forest of the Northeast. And then we'll start to create scaffolding for learning exchanges between the landscapes around building real world prototypes with real funding. And so in a way, what we're doing here in Barichara is like practicing. How do we practice doing this? And the one thing that I had mentioned in the presentation I gave 2 weeks ago is that we have a very practical challenge in a time frame in Barichara, where we have 3 processes that are ongoing, that if we had the adequate funding for them, they could continue or they could be achieved. And that the total amount of money for those 3 processes for the next year, starting in January, is $100,000. That if we were able to raise $100,000, we could fund some really powerful work in the Bioparque Moncora. We'd be able to fund the teaching staff for the entire year of Sueños del Bosque, and we could negotiate the potential acquisition of the land that would be the long-term home of the school Sueños del Bosque connected with the Bioparque. So we talked about that in the presentation I gave 2 weeks ago. And then we started talking about what was resonant for people and what would people like to work on. And there was a great set of questions that Carrie was bringing forth about, how do we turn this into something understandable? This is so complex, but there are some real opportunities to turn this into a case study or a model, something that would be teachable for others to replicate or just to increase the learning for people who are doing similar things in other landscapes. And Joshua was talking a bit about, which Josh, you could speak a little more today if you like, about some of the things he's involved with related to regenerative entrepreneurship. And I might call them like innovation ecosystems for regenerative leadership, people who are learning together as they're trying to do this work. And so you can already start to feel that the direction we went in that conversation was less about how do we raise money and more how do we create teachable opportunities, learning tools to accelerate the way that we're doing this work and also to build stories that can be used for fundraising and for strategic partnerships and other valuable things. And so we were starting to feel this presence of synergy, but we didn't actually map it out. We didn't have the time after I'd given a long presentation and everyone's absorbing the ridiculous, like the fire hose of information that I gave. We didn't really have time for us to start exploring, what do we actually want to be doing here and how can we bring our talents and what is really the most valuable things that you would want to do that could help the work in Barichara, but also help your work and help our work together. And so what I thought we would do today, and it's actually really nice we're a smaller group because we don't need to do breakouts or anything with a group this size, is to just start a conversation about what is emerging here in this space together and from each of you around what we can do together, knowing that what we're doing here is going to be able to inform directly the work we're starting in the different landscapes. And beginning with the greater Takaranto bioregion, because Brian and Susan have done so much work mapping out stakeholder networks and building relationships and identifying fundable opportunities. I don't know what the actual scale of funding would be for just the conservation authorities that they're working with, but just to give you a sense of scale, there are already among the 13 conservation authorities in Southern Ontario, there are already 20,000 ecosystem restoration projects that they have identified and that are shovel ready, that if they had the funding, they could start to do them. So that's probably a couple $100 million. Just to give you a sense of like the scale of a funding ecosystem in the GTB is huge. That's without talking about acquiring land or converting agriculture or many other things we could talk about in that very complex landscape. So in a way, like Barichara is a little sandbox. For as complex as it is, it's also a little sandbox. 6,000 people in the town, maybe 15 to 20,000 people if you combine the neighboring towns and the campesinos that live in the countryside. So it's actually sort of beautifully easier, even though it's still very, very complex. And so what I wanted to invite today is for us to just talk about this, um, to start exploring what we would like to do, what kinds of workflow, what kinds of projects. Like, for example, Carrie, in the last 2 weeks, have you been thinking about doing a case study? Would we want to organize a case study? Is there something else that's coming up for someone that didn't get mentioned or that's just coming up now? And of course, we can connect all of this back to whatever we're building. We can create direct learning opportunities with all of the design school. So that could be like, webinars that could be hosted or just informational sessions or, create a video presenting it or a slide deck, like we can actually learn together and mobilize the capacities of the design school into this and then bring that to everyone else. So that was what I had in mind for today. And so maybe we could just go around and do like an opening circle of just one at a time, sharing a little bit of like, how are you arriving here today? And this prompt I've just given you, what is bubbling up for you from this invitation? And then I think after we do that little round of opening, we'll have a better sense of what is wanting to arrive into this space. And so maybe just whoever would like to go first could go first and then pass it to the next person so we can be somewhat efficient about a circle of sharing, but I won't put anyone on the spot. So is there anyone that would like to share first, just how you're doing and what is this prompting in you?
Hi, everybody. I guess I'll go. I'm doing pretty good. I feel a little overwhelmed by the expansiveness of what's going on, but that's a good thing because we want this to be expansive. I'm intrigued with the idea that commerce is one of the most powerful forces that currently exist in the world today. And it should be love and it should be all that other stuff. But the reality is has a lot of power that it is wielding. And so being able to harness that power at a localized scale into regenerative economies, mostly around food production and food distribution, uh, that's an entrepreneur related, there's many entrepreneur players in that. And just how could that all work together to be regenerative? And I'm being very specific with the word regenerative. Regenerative means that life flourishes and exists without any additional inputs. So there's no periodic inputs. We need to get this fund. We need to get this. We need to get this water. We need to do all of these artificial things. No, it should be regenerative in that gets to a point where it's self-sustaining. And that's what I think these local economies and networks of entrepreneurs linked together could achieve that. So that's me. That's my reason for being here. My interests.
Thank you, Brian.
Ricardo.
Oh yeah,
Ricardo,
awesome.
are you ready to go, Ricardo?
Yes, Brian, thank you. Um, well, many things are unfolding um, around, and I just got like a very, I'm kind of naive. I mean, I trust people, I trust the good intentions. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it doesn't really happen anything. But I'm in touch with some a foundation and some guys that are doing some ecosystem restoration in the Caribbean, in the Venezuelan coast, pretty close to the place where I am right now. And at the same time, in Mogotes, that's the town of my family is pretty close to Barichara. There's also like a steering movement of my family and friends that want to, go deeper, and and it's like the time I really sense the value of creating these networks. They want to go to Barichara and learn like kind of, a group, it's not a large group of people, but there are some um, very interested people in what's going on around the regeneration projects in Barichara. And they want to give like a step forward in Mogotes. So, I'm kind of all over the place in Venezuela and in Colombia. I don't know how to, you know, uh, concentrate myself really. I just get so, happy with everything going on, and, I need more focus, I guess. But yeah, as I told you, uh, many things going on. I really love to have these exchanges, learning exchanges. So that's the main reason I'm here. So that's all for me, and I pass it over to Carrie if you are ready.
Thank you, Ricardo. I'm feeling selfishly excited that we're an intimate group today too, um, and appreciate being able to get into sort of the practice together. And I just want to thank Maria Elena for her amazing presentation. I was so moved and so heartened um, by not only the work you've been doing, but also the way you are telling the story to us. It's very clear and accessible, and that is, I feel, one of the important underpinnings of the work. So thank you and congratulations. Uh, so yes, Joe, I mean, needless to say, I've been thinking a lot about a lot of things, and I too feel overwhelmed um, most of the time. So just to relate, Brian. Um, so yeah, I have a million things on my mind, but I guess to kind of ground myself here for a moment, um, Joe, two of the threads from our last conversation that have been rattling around for me are this question of investor education. Um, and I'll tell you why about that in a second. And the second is the regenerative travel piece. So I've had a conversation with one of my colleagues who's a regenerative travel specialist, and she's very interested. We are both together very interested in seeing how that might, a case study might come to fruition in that. So we could talk more about that either today or offline. But getting back to the investor education piece, as I zoom out, right? As I zoom out on the field of regenerative finance or the field of regeneration and regenerative bioregional regeneration in general, Joshua knows this because we've been in the Global Regeneration Collab together for since, I don't know, 2020 or something, a long time. We have heard these stories of the challenges of getting the capital to flow, right, at the volume that's required, at the pace that is required. Um, so I think that's the heart of my inquiry, and through my very modest contribution in the global regeneration finance initiative that we've been working on. We've talked, and this is not a new concept, I'm sure, for folks here, but like we've talked about this question of acupuncture points. Like, how do we find these places where we can unlock at the scale and volume that's necessary? And so that's just really weighing on my heart today, because as I continue to see all this incredible work that's being done on the ground and, you know, in our individual spheres, and then, you know, wonderfully now coming together a little bit more, connecting the dots, where like, you know, building these ecosystems, trying to do this more collaboratively, which is beautifully more efficient and effective, I think, ultimately, than how many of us have felt like we've had to work in isolation. um the question still does arise for me of, you know, this rub of the, you know, the investor return requirements, because like that is the rub. And also the question of how finance is applied, and so that's one of the things we're considering in our work. So I would just love to hear folks share any insights or ideas or dreams about how we might collectively activate bigger flows. And that's not to say that the micro work isn't important and essential. It's not to dismiss that. It's not to get just overly abstract about this. It's just to say maybe both and. So that's sort of how I'm arriving today.
Thank you, Carrie. Would you like to pass it on to the next person?
Sorry, Joshua.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, I'll start off maybe more how I'm showing up personally, and then dive more into the work that's coming alive for me. Personally, I'm kind of in this coming apart. I don't know if anybody's seen that pattern where they send ohms to a plate and you see the different patterns formalized at different ohms, but there's that coming apart first and then reformalizing around the new wavelength. That's what I feel like right now. I feel like I'm coming apart and then trying to understand my new formulation at a higher vibration. And so I'm also in a place that where I'm possibly going to be moving to Colombia myself, which is kind of exciting. Emily, my wife, is trying to find an educator role as a teacher at some private schools in Colombia, most likely Bogota, because that seems to be my climate and our family's climate is right around there. And we've had some friends and we visited the area, and we kind of have a sense that we would thrive in that area. So we're looking at some private schools there, and I'm saying that because I really think where Colombia is right now, I feel like they have gone through a lot and are able to start to create change because of what they've gone through, which is really cool. And I feel that energy when I've been there, and I've spoken to Colombians. There's a lot of Colombians that live in Panama, and they talk about their country in a totally different way than Panamanians talk about their country. And I sense that. And so I'm kind of feeling that energy to try and move into a place where I feel like I would be more valued, and that I could find more value with those I collaborate with. So that's how I'm showing up personally. Where I'm kind of, where my work is kind of moving me into really great places is I've been working on trying to build an association for regenerative entrepreneurship, a global association for regenerative entrepreneurship. And I feel like the KPI that we've been trying to work around within this association is how many collaborations can we have in a given time period, in a week, in a month, in a year? How many ways can we collaborate with multiple stakeholders that are trying to move towards a new regenerative economy? But I believe the entrepreneur is that keystone species in a lot of ways. They're willing to take on risk. They're willing to do things. And so entrepreneurs can be for good or for bad, but they often act as a keystone species on the environment around them because they're willing to take on risks. They're willing to move into spaces. And when I look at an entrepreneur, They could be a non-for-profit organization. They could be, but what really defines a entrepreneur for me is someone that's willing to take on risk to create the change they want to see. And a regenerative entrepreneur is that person that's willing to take on the risks to see a new regenerative economy, a new regenerative future. So that's what's showing up for me. The things that we're working on in that space is very aligned with what you're doing, Joe, and Carrie, and I believe everybody that's here. How can we build more collaborative spaces between stakeholders, between investors, between the entrepreneur, between the ecosystem builder, between the educator? And so the association that we're trying to build is first to the first work that we've been trying to do is first to understand all the stakeholders that are wanting to advocate and see regenerative entrepreneurs thrive, or regenerative entrepreneurship thrive. And so that's where I've been working on. I've been working on the entrepreneur side first for a while, and the educators of entrepreneurs, and trying to figure out those stakeholders. Can we bring in enough educators to help teach the next generation of entrepreneurs to create change? And I realized that was a good place to start, but also a really hard place to start, because there's no funding in that for an association. And so now I'm also really taking a strong focus towards building a membership tier, a paid membership tier within our association that is the investor. And what is of value for the investor is the main question. For an investor that's wanting to invest in regenerative enterprises, what is the value that they're needing? And that's the question that I'm trying to answer right now, and it's taking most of my time in that space. So I'm going to leave it there. That's what's showing up for me, and I'll pass it over to Maria and Elena.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, first of all, thank you, Carrie, for your thank you. I'm new in this space, first time here, and actually I came because I was reminded of the call by Carrie. So Carrie, you asked that I come, so here I am. Yeah, no, I really wanted to be here as well. I'm just curious, really want to hear what's on people's minds and more about what Joe's been doing in Barichara as well. So nothing else on my mind. That's it. Thank you. Oh, I'll pass it to Joan.
Thanks, Maria Elena. I would just echo Carrie's, just so thrilled to learn about all of your project, the success, and how it's growing. It's very, very encouraging. I'm in the Greater Toronto bioregion, and I feel kind of wounded today. Not gonna lie, we've had we had the trail end of Hurricane Beryl came through, and then we had where normally after a hurricane, my experience is you get sort of brilliant clear weather because all of the moisture has been sucked out of the atmosphere. Unfortunately, we were hit with a series of really severe storms that has caused, well, they're referring it to as a $1 billion flood. There's been severe flooding in the city of Toronto and in my own area, which is probably 100 kilometers outside of Toronto. That it just seems to be the same thing happened in 2013. It's frustrating. I just don't know that people are seeing what's really happening here and that we have to do things differently. And so I am pleased to be here and connect with people who are doing positive work. I love to learn from Joe and think of it as a case study. I don't feel like I have really much insight into what work Brian's doing, so a little bit of frustration there. Brian Pupa, that is. I have a sense of nervousness about putting a lot of money into the conservation authorities in Ontario because they are a creation of our provincial government, and the current government is undermining them. And I kind of feel like next week they could decide to dissolve those conservation authorities somehow, even though they're obviously, their work is incredibly important because they work to protect, do flood control and protect wetlands and so on. But anyway, sorry, I'm just in a really kind of setback this week. And I'm looking to find some hope. Thank you. And I'll pass it to David. Maybe he has a more hopeful message from Greater Toronto than I do.
Well, okay, so I'm actually in the city of Toronto, fortunately very close to a sacred river that runs through the city. It's a wildlife corridor, and there's right in the center of the city, we have deer and coyotes and foxes and rabbits and all sorts of good things. And it's so as long as that river is there, I feel there's some connection. Just talking to my neighbor who's been commenting on American politics and how hopeless everything looks. And it just reminds me of how important this work is. That, yes, that collapse is accelerating, actually. We know it's absolutely necessary, but it's painful, and we are one of the extremely privileged that we can choose to engage or not engage at this point. But there are people obviously who are in the center of it who have no choice. And so I feel my privilege tremendously. I'm here just because I'm intensely curious about what's going on in Barichara. When it comes to financing, I think we had a little conversation earlier with Maria Elena about how my eyes glaze over when I think of finance and anything like that. And so it's so completely removed from my consciousness that I'm, first of all, in awe of those who know how to do this stuff, and to do it ethically. I think, I mean, finance to me is the antithesis of the real economy. And so, you know, when finance can be used in a regenerative way, I'm all ears, but totally ignorant. So I came late, so I don't know who hasn't gone yet.
Julie is the last remaining person. So Julie, over to you. Welcome.
Hi, I have a bad cold. I don't know how this happened. But yeah, I had big plans for talk about privilege. You think you have a choice, and then your body says, Anyway, so I was gonna see Joe today later, in the evening. Aw, I know, because he's in Seattle, and I'm on the Olympic Peninsula here in Washington. And then I had such big plans. I think I scared myself and got a cold. From there at 9 o'clock when we were done, I was going to drive down to Salem, Oregon, and be a part of the next day, be a part of Resilient Communities meeting in person for, I think, one of the first times. Let's see, I think some of you were a part of those conversations. Maybe you, Brian. Anyway, no. Anyway, so that was interesting. And then I thought I'd drop by the Fairy Congress of Michael Pilarski Skeeter, because that happens to be in Salem. I've never been there. And then I was gonna visit friends on River Road in Eugene. Ravi Logan just met with Brandon. Brandon just went to visit him. That was interesting. And Dharma Lion, the Proud Institute. Ultimately, I was gonna show up 2 days in advance to Cascadia Songrise and help get that set up, and the 25th to the 29th, and then come home. And it's like, oh my God, I mostly am just here by myself. My life is so simple. Well, with my husband. Anyway, so I'm my body is saying you're not doing any of that. So I'm just trying to, like, really? Okay. yay, I think I get to spend more time in my garden. So I'm really enjoying my garden, um, moving plants around to where they'll be better, well, they're where they'll be happier. And yeah, I'm here because um, I'm curious what, what's happening, what the successes are, Joe, that you're having in Barichara. And to gather the only way that I can digitally with like-minded people. And yeah, funding is something that I would say is not just my eyes glaze over like you, David, but it's like I don't have a clue how that's done. So I need to be exposed to examples. I really find, even though I don't have much knowledge, I'm fascinated by the idea of new economies. Because myself, I feel without having any really clear good reason to, I feel like I have something to offer. Like I have a deep hunger to serve and give, have my whole life. And so alternate governance, alternate economies is attracting me, but I'm not very knowledgeable in it. So I'm excited to hear how things are going and to gather with you guys, at least this way.
Thank you, Julian. Gosh, bless the gardeners, right? Go piddle with your plants, please. We need more of that in the world. Gosh, what a beautiful diversity of expressions that have just come in. I am feeling this like sort of to sort of map the patterns a little bit. This sense of how do we, as Brian was saying, like how do we create these regenerative flows in a real economy so that the economy is autopoietic, so that the economy is able to be self-sustaining. And then connecting it to some of the ideas that were coming up, and Joshua and Carrie were both speaking about this in different ways, about really how do we understand financial flows as they support education and leadership and helping people to create multi-directional learning exchanges. So like the investors are learning, but also supporting, and the value flows are going in multiple directions. And that a real key in this is the devoted people, like you were saying, Joshua, about those who are willing to take the risk. And then another side of that is a devotion to the process and a willingness to change. And you're just starting to feel some patterns in that. And then the sense of despair and the need for the antidote, which I think is a really big deal. As I was, stuck in the US propaganda machine, we were in a hotel in Boulder, and I'd go down to their like hotel breakfast, and it was 100% of the content was about Donald Trump. Even the stuff about Joe Biden was about Donald Trump. And it was just gross. The whole thing was gross. And when you know what's going on in the world, if you know just a little of what's going on in the world, there's a lot more going on than a narcissist and a psychopath talking to each other, right? Like there's a whole lot more going on, but that's what the media system focuses on. And just feeling such a profound need for unlocking the financial flows to scale up to bioregional governance, to basically let the breakdown be an enabler of transformation rather than just an enabler of violence. And so I think there's real urgency and real like presence of significance of the choices we're making. And I also heard a few of you mentioning that you wanted to learn more about what's going on in Barichara after I'd said at the beginning, well, I wasn't planning on presenting about Barichara, but I do want to present, oh, I don't want to present. I want to show you a graphic that I made because this kind of relates, oops, that's the wrong button. This kind of relates to something Carrie was saying about going to larger scale. So I'm just going to show you a little graphic that I made the other day. I'm not quite ready for public viewing in the sense that I want to tell the full story, but I wanted you all to see this graphic. Because this is a graphic where, I bet this thing is in my way. Move that out of my way. There we go. I had someone on Facebook the other day say, Joe, I love what you're doing and I'd like to donate some money, but I'm really confused. What are all the projects you're funding? And I was like, wow, that is confusing. And so I went and made this really simple graphic to show where are we working on organizing portfolios of projects to do regenerative finance at large scales? And Maria Elena, you'll notice that I didn't include you here because we haven't talked about it yet. But I could very easily put you on a map like this and include the other half of the Earth, not just the Americas. But I wanted you to see, like, when we were in the Ogallala with Will Masters last week, it just felt really clear that we need to raise $100 million and start a process of regenerating the Ogallala. Probably we need like 2 or 3 billion, but let's start small with 100 million, but don't start small with 100,000. And you can start to see that just from this graphic, what we're talking about doing is creating the Earth Regeneration Fund, and we'll be talking more about this soon. So supporting a network of bioregional funding ecosystems. And I just wanted to briefly show this to you to say there's some really big things developing, and Penny and I are playing our own role of doing mycelial weaving to make these big things happen. We have our small part to play in it, but it's happening. It's coming into being. And a lot of what we are prototyping to replicate has been inspired by the direct experience of what we've done in Barichara. And so of just doing it in practice. Like what happens when you bring a small amount of money and a couple of key stakeholders and they practice spending it together? What happens? Turns out there's a huge amount of learning that happens and you build trust. And so there are ways of like embodying these practices. And so, so I guess what I'm feeling from what I've heard from you in this like opening round of sharing is this sense that we could focus on a couple of different things, or different people could lead different activities. You know, so one person could say, Brian could say, well, I'm really interested in this thing and I'm just going to go off and do a little work on it. Or a couple of people can come together and form a group and say, we're really interested in this together. So, but it's just to say we don't all have to do the same thing. Just want to name that up front. We don't have to all do the same thing. But what I think is our great opportunity is to practice, to actually say, well, what does it mean to do this? And it's funny, like I turned my phone upside down because I'm getting so many notifications right now about how to set up the contracts for this $150,000 of funding that came in. That's funding 10 different projects, but it's funding the 10 different projects, which includes contracts to about 20 different people. And we're spending all of the money in like 6 months, and it's funding a whole web of things across the territory. And just the admin, like just how do you do contracts? Because it's money from a nonprofit to local people. Actually, in our case, it's from a foundation that had a donor-advised fund that then gave the money to a foundation in Bogota, that then gave the funding to our foundation in Barichara, that then is distributing it to all of the local projects. You start to see how complex this can be. And it's because our new nonprofit, Colombian law requires that an organization exists legally for 6 months before it can receive international money to avoid money laundering. So to receive money in Barichara, we had to receive money from an older organization that's more than 6 months old. So there's one in Bogota. So this is like, just to give you a feel for how much institutions and administration matter, even though they're, if you do your job right, they're really invisible, right? Like you don't even see them from the stories on the ground, but they're actually just setting up the contracts and the admin is a really big deal. And if we want to move more money, if we want to have $1 million instead of 150,000 or $10 million, then we're just like taking that, we're just pushing that horse up a big hill, right? So just naming that there's a lot of stuff like that going on. Carrie, come on in. What do you want to share?
Well, I didn't want to stop the flow of your thoughts, but I do appreciate the complexity, and you know, maybe that's something for us to think about: is how might we, or is it possible to reduce the complexity of the administration side? But the thought I was coming into today with, and that you've just now underscored, is one thing that could be helpful, and not to put you on the spot, but one thing that could be helpful in my mind is seeing where the funds are flowing from. You know, the map of, you know, what's the proportion of, you know, micro contributions to DAF, you know, large DAF grants, or, you know, what are the sources of funding that you've been able to attract so far to give us a sense of like, oh, okay, well, you shouldn't spend your time on X, but this is a, better, just as some kind of like a map of that could be really powerful if that's something that we could think about.
Yeah, I'd be happy to sort of walk through some of that story, because the composition and the size depends so much on the stage of development. But before I do that, Brian, what would you like to share?
Well, it's kind of piggyback, what Carrie was saying, is that also not only are these the source of funds, because you'll have a superset of funds, a collective superset of funds that other people may be able to draw into by type, by type. And but also have that compilation include the lessons learned in dealing with each type of fund. And if you're dealing with this type of fund, then this is what we've learned. If this other type of fund, it's a different animal, and this is what we've learned. I think I would find that useful.
That sounds, gosh, can't you just feel a case study or a guidebook or something coming into being? I love it. It's so helpful. David, over to you.
Yeah, so one thing that concerns me and like many people, I think, is sources of funding, like how much greenwashing is going on. I think of the Royal Bank of Canada, which is a huge funder of the tar sands and extraction industry, but at the same time has this benevolent environmental fund that funds a lot of really good projects. The one hand does not know what the other hand is doing, but it concerns me some of the ethics of fundraising and knowing where the money's come from, who it's coming from, what circuitous kind of greenwashing events is it flowing through, and so on. So I'm just curious how other people are dealing with that.
Oh yeah, I have a specific example of that, which is that some of the funding we receive in Barichara is from Gitcoin, and Gitcoin is a platform for people to donate money, and then there's an algorithm for determining a matching pool of funding, how it's allocated to the projects. So there's a way that funding is allocated through an algorithm based on the number of people that donate, and you end up with some interesting explorations with that. But there was a parallel round of funding from Shell, the oil company, and some people would choose to accept it and others wouldn't. And so that ethical question was made visible by it being, do you accept money from the Shell pool of money in the matching pool? But because they made it visible, you could actually have a discourse around it, which was interesting. So just to signal what David is pointing out is really important. Does this feel good to everyone to maybe talk through this typology of funding a little bit and get a feel for that? Julie, yeah. Oh, you're muted.
The disadvantage of being on phone. Okay. I'd like to actually hear, and again, if there's something more juicy, I'll surrender. But I'd like to actually hear what the downside is of why you wouldn't take money from the bad uses and funnel it into good uses. That kind of came up another time with Paul Sergino and the Education Guild here. It's like we do need to take money from the big source of it and channel it into good uses. So ethically, you could say, oh yeah, we wouldn't take money from greenwashing or Shell or whatever, but what is the reason for that, really? I mean, what is the thinking behind that? Why wouldn't we rechannel that basically energy of money into a good use from a bad?
Well, actually, that's a good place to start, because one of the things that I did when I started raising money in Barichara, I drew a picture. The picture is really simple. It was a circle. Barichara is in the middle, and there's money from the outside, and they made an arrow that looked like the photon that bounces off. Like it's not allowed in, so it bounces away. But some arrows are allowed to come in. So it's a selective membrane, a permeable membrane, like in a biological cell. And what a biological cell does when its membrane is functioning is the membrane decides what the cell allows in, which means the cell has autonomy and sovereignty. And so one of the first principles of bringing money into a landscape from the outside is whether or not the funding comes in with the sovereignty of the people in the community. It's basically the people should be in a position, an empowered position, to say no to funding that they don't want because they don't want its conditions. And say yes to the money that they do want because they approve of the conditions. And so that sovereignty being within the community is a really important part of dealing with ethics. Not the only one, but you can see that's a big one, right? You're like, we would take a lot of money if we are completely sovereign to decide how it's spent. But if you have strings attached that we don't agree with, you see, it's like, it's a really big deal. And so finding funding that doesn't have strings attached that the local people would disagree with, there can be strings attached, but what kinds of strings? And then I'll just comment on that, that the way that I identify which strings are acceptable is through Eleanor Ostrom's work on governing the commons and what's called core design principle number 1, which is shared identity and purpose. As if the people bringing money have a shared identity and purpose, then we're pretty likely to agree on what the strings are. So an example is, I want funding to go to children getting nature education. That's a string, that's a constraint. And the local people are like, we want money to give nature education to kids. Well, that's just called an agreement, right? Like we agree on that. So that alignment of purpose is a really big deal. If you have alignment of purpose and clarity of purpose, it gets you a long way toward addressing the ethics of money. Not the only thing, but you can see how big a deal it is. Because you can accept all kinds of conditions that are in service to the purpose, or that at least don't compromise the purpose by having a really clear sense of purpose. So maybe I'll share a little bit of the kinds of funding we brought in at different times and the composition, like what proportion and which one. The work in the Barichara Regeneration Fund started with $50,000 that was raised using crowdfunding. And that was to spend about $35,000 purchasing a piece of land that later became the nature reserve that we call Orientalagua. So I have this beautiful nature reserve, beautiful reforestation project, lots of education work, and we bought the land with crowdfunding. And then the other $15,000 that we had in surplus ended up going to support 15 local projects. And there was a whole process we went through to set up that governance. I won't go into that now because I just want to talk about sources of money and composition. That $50,000 came in 2 forms. They came in individual donations. Someone that would give $5 or $50. I think the largest single donation was about $3,800. It was the person who had some Ethereum, and Ethereum was worth a lot at the time. It's a cryptocurrency. It was before the market crashed. And they donated the remaining amount to get us to our goal. So the one person who donated $3,800 was that final donation. But most of the donations were like between $5 and $100. There were about 150 donors, just to give you a sense, with a couple of people that gave like $1,000 or $2,000, very few of those, and a lot of people that gave a smaller amount of money. And there was a remaining $16,000 to reach our goal that we did through 0 interest loans, which was in order to purchase the land when it was time to do so. I had a friend help me create a distribution of equity so that no donor or investor would have too much power. We agreed that of the $16,000 that we were going to basically have a kind of debt we had to pay back. This was asking friends to make, personal loans of money with no interest to pay them back 2 years later, was what it was. And the equity structure was that no individual donor could give more than 1/3 of the total debt, which meant that to get to that $16,000, we had a division of something like you could give between $2,000 and $5,000. We did it something like that. And so we ended up with 4 people each giving an amount between $2,000 and $4,000 that we had 2 years to pay them back. So you can start to see but this was part of our crowdfunding because that was actually, they put in their trust and they put in an obligation to raise more money, which was necessary because we actually, as Brian was alluding to earlier, we actually need sustainable financial flow. So the pressure to raise more money to pay off that 0 interest debt felt very ethical in this situation. I come from poverty. I grew up in poverty, so I have an absolute aversion to debt. You know, debt causes people to die when they're in poverty. Debt is really, really dangerous to people in poverty. So in this situation, I felt comfortable because all of the people, all four of the people were friends that I felt comfortable if I needed to extend, they would extend, because I had a really good personal relationship with them. We ended up paying it off in less than 2 years and it was fine. But I just wanted you to know that part of the reality, that initial $50,000. Later, we started raising money in two primary ways. One was we created the Barichara Pledge Community, which was individual people who would donate $1,000. They would pledge to give $1,000 for our learning ecosystem. And we ended up having about 40 people, so about $40,000 in $1,000 donations. Notice in all of these cases, we had complete authority to spend the money any way we wanted. Now, we needed to honor our agreements with the people donating the money, or else they wouldn't give us more money. And they'd go and trash talk us, and we would deserve that. So there was something we had to give back to them. But what we had to give back to them is we had to show that we were doing what we said we were going to do, which is what we wanted to do anyway. So it's pretty easy to do that, right? But I just wanted to name that that agreement was implicit in a donation. And it's very, very important that it was there. People gave money because they wanted to see some other kind of return. They just didn't need their money back. And so that $40,000 was used to fund all kinds of things, because it's like a flexible fund to like, oh, we need to, pay this teacher for 2 months to develop this curriculum thing, or, oh, this thing came up and we need some tools, or we need to build a tool shed. We just had a lot of flexibility. And over the span of 2 years, we spent that money in lots of creative ways. But then also we started raising money with Gitcoin, which is that crowdfunding platform of a matching pool with people donating money in cryptocurrency, which means we had to figure out how to turn the cryptocurrency into fiat currency, into Colombian pesos. And turns out that's complicated because the central banks try to destroy cryptocurrency at the off-ramp. Basically, the central banks have taken control of the crypto world by making it really hard to turn it into US dollars or other government-backed currencies. And then they surveil the hell out of you at all those places. So they basically destroy the authority of independent currencies if you try and put them into fiat. You'll get a really beautiful glimpse into the negative version of the financial system ironically, by trying to liberate yourself with cryptocurrency. You end up being stuck in these traps that the central banks have set up anyway. But we've now raised in 3 different rounds around maybe $65,000 or $70,000 from Gitcoin, which is to say that we have individual donors donating money. There's a matching pool, and based on the number of donors and amount of donations, there's an algorithm, and you get part of the matching pool in competition with other projects. So it might be 100 projects with a $200,000 matching fund. And if you have a really popular project, you get a larger percentage of the matching fund than someone else. That's like, in simple terms, the idea is something like that. And so we've raised a decent amount of money, $65,000, $70,000 that way. We also had small foundations learn about our work and just decide they wanted to support us. The Mustard Seed Trust Foundation in Amsterdam, hearing about our work and saying, can we give you $10,000? We're like, yes, we'll take it. We'll put it in our syntropic agroforestry. They're like, we just need it to fund women, doing local community development work related to regeneration. Like, it's easy. The people running that project are Tanya and Ceci. Boom, we're good. And so that was basically retroactively writing a grant application. Like, fill out this form because we're going to give you the money. We did not compete for funding. We never applied to a foundation for funding. We only filled out the form when we were asked. And that happened on one occasion. And we also had an individual donor give $25,000 to support the syntropic agroforestry work in its first year. And it was someone who was really connected to the work, someone from the US, a friend of the work, someone who was visiting Barichara, and they had received an inheritance and they gave $25,000 and that all of it was earmarked, is focused on one specific area, the syntropic agroforestry work. And then later when there's a whole story around the Novo Foundation and my relationship to it, but this is money from Warren Buffett, managed by one of Warren Buffett's children, Peter Buffett, and his wife, Jennifer. They have a $6 billion foundation, the Novo Foundation, and they fund some of the most innovative work on earth. They fund lots of indigenous groups. Anyway, they just do a ton of stuff. They're kind of like frickin' amazing is what I call them. And one of my good friends ended up becoming one of the lead people there. And he was working on local living economies, but then he started talking to me and realized he's actually doing bioregional regeneration. Long story short, 6 months later, the focus of all of the funding from Nova Foundation is on bioregional regeneration now. Completely there, mobilizing, I don't know how much money they put in the last year, $10 million or more. They're just putting money into lots of people, lots of projects, and building capacity. So there's a ton of stuff happening now through Nova Foundation. And they gave Penny and me the money for us to do the travel that we do associated with the design school. They gave us the surplus money we're using as the seed funds for the funding ecosystems that are starting in September. And they gave $150,000 to Barichara, which is the money that's going through all that administrative work right now and being administered. And they just approved $150,000 to the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund. That money will arrive in September. So I wanted you to have a sense that we're now at a point where we can receive larger funds, but we have a very special funder who gives discretionary funding based completely on trust. We can do whatever we want with the money. And so I basically passed it over to our team at the Territorial Foundation, who had already been creating a 5-year plan, mapping local processes. And they had a $5 million budget. And they just sort of went back to everyone and said, in the next 6 months, what are your highest priorities? We got 150,000. We don't have enough for 5 years, but let's keep going. And so now you can start to see the composition and the variety of funding sources. Individual donors at the level of $5 up to $25,000. Foundation grants ranging from a $10,000 to $150,000. Also, we've now had 2 businesses that wanted to turn their carbon offset money into donations to us. One of them about $8,000, the other one about $1,500, so both of them modest, but a very different kind of relationship of just, we see what you post on LinkedIn and we know you're doing it, so here's money, sort of relationship. So there's none of that reporting and stuff. There's like, Joe, you document well enough with your social media feed. It's super cool. Can we give our money to what you're doing in Barichara instead of something else? And I just had a call with their sustainability director this morning at it's a software company in Germany called Inform Software. They have 1,000 employees. They have been bringing SDG, Sustainable Development Goal thinking, to all 1,000 of their employees. And their city, where their headquarters is based, just contracted to be one of the 100 climate neutral cities of Europe in the European Green Deal and a Green New Deal. And so I had a conversation with them this morning about how they could join the design school and how we could start helping them to do bioregional thinking in Germany. And they didn't even know about this because they just knew about our work in Barichara. But I just wanted to sort of paint a picture. You see, it's a very dynamic picture. And it's all about personal relationships. All the way up to the large funding. It's all about personal relationships. Carrie, please.
I'm so sorry. I just realized I'm late for a client. I gotta go, but
Oh, no.
I'll get you the question later. Sorry. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Carrie.
Bye, Carrie.
So yeah, I don't know, Brian, come on in. Yeah.
I'm struck by a couple of things. One is, if I take a strategic view of what you just laid out there, and were to summarize it, if somebody asked me to summarize it, then I would say that you did not specifically go after funding sources. Instead, there was a little bit of that maybe, but instead the general takeaway is you created an environment. And from that environment, things emerged. And what emerged was a diversity, which is, I think, very, very powerful. Small donors, different kinds of currency involved, word of mouth. These are all very organic things. Just because you created an environment of trust, and an environment of vision. And that is inspiring, because instead of a cookbook type of approach towards, oh yeah, this fund and this fund and this fund, it's we can create the trust networks, and built on what people that have gone before us, such as yourself, Joe, you and Penny, we can say, oh yeah, why can't we do that? Why can't we do that? And then things will naturally emerge. And that is a very regenerative approach. And it's the diversity makes it very resilient. And so we're not tied to this one funder and what happens if the economy crashes and their portfolios tank and, you know, that takes our system down also. No, no, no. You have diversity built into it. That diversity came out naturally through this environment that you created. That's my takeaway from what you shared.
Well, I think that's where Julie can see that doing permaculture work and doing financial design are the same thing. It really is creating that garden assembly of plants in many ways. I'm just curious what others are seeing, questions, comments, or ideas for how we move forward. Any or all of the above. Joan.
I wanted to remark that what I see rather than the hierarchy is just this the weaving interconnection, a tapestry. And I love that the individual donors who've given $5 and the donors that are, handing over thousands and thousands of dollars seem to have equal respect and are mentioned with the same kind of gratitude and reverence, and that comes from the fact that it's built on trust and relationships. And I just really I love that and really, really appreciate that.
Thank you, Joan. David.
So what I'm hearing is what the thing to do is to create a story that's so compelling that people just want to get excited by it and find it so exciting they want to be part of it somehow, even if it's contributing $5. And that through that, then other people pick up on the excitement. So it's really, how do we tell the story in a way that the guy across the street who is feeling despair about what's going on in the world and is looking for something to grab onto that makes life meaningful again, will say, yeah, I'll give you $5. Or the accountant or the small business owner who says, yeah, things are pretty rough. Yeah, okay, this sounds like a good deal. Something like that. I don't know. It's in the story. How do we create that compelling story so we don't have to talk down to the people who don't consider themselves part of this, but are looking for something to latch onto. Does that make any sense?
I think it makes a lot of sense. And I would just add that a really inspiring story can be manipulative. And I just want to name that. And that's where the greenwashing stuff can come in and other things.
Yeah. That's true. And people and corporations have a lot of money to create with their PR funds to create that compelling story, that they use all the right words and evoke the right emotions, but are doing it for their own profit margins.
Well, but what's interesting is when there's an embodiment of real relationship, then that manipulation will backfire very quickly. Manipulation and deception are dangerous strategies in a context of trust. So I just want to name that that's part of the protection against manipulation. Doing it out in the open means it's very powerful because it's accountable, but you're accountable if you go unethical too. So just recognizing that's built in. Joshua, please, what are you thinking?
Yeah, there was a few things that came up. Joan, that was really kind of cool that you brought that up, the balance of the importance that there's extreme value with just a $5 donor compared to $1,000 donor, or someone that philanthropy money. It kind of reminds me of the story in that Jesus tells about the widow's mite, right? And that it reminded me of that. It's like that mite matters way more than the person that had a lot of money in the actual grand schemes of it, because of what it meant for that person, the widow, to give that mite, right? And I think we really gotta understand that as especially for philanthropy money is like there's the story and everything. That's who you're serving in a lot of ways, is that person that really is putting in an extreme amount of money for themselves. You know, like it's hard for me sometimes to put $5 when I have a family of 6, and you know I'm trying to you know. So that person that hit me, Joan, when you had said that. The other thing that's I feel like I hope adds to the conversation as well is we're actually really talking about one type of money, and it's philanthropy. It's donation. And there's still a huge part of our current economy that you know that isn't in that kind of gift realm, or that and so there's still transactional, or there's still, you know, like an energy flow. And there's where philanthropy money has typically been used in a lot of ways, and where is for projects like this, like where you don't really see a commercialized form of that money being used in the economy itself, right? So it needs to, it either maybe has potential in the future for that, but it doesn't have it right now. And so you need philanthropy money to be able to move you towards affecting the economy in a more give-receive cycle of what an economy is right now. And so I'm curious to know, maybe Joe, you've had this thought, or what, because the realm that I'm usually in is the entrepreneur that is actually taking venture capital, doing debt financing, or you know, maybe it's a combination of debt equity or different. Those are the other types of financial capital financing instruments that I'm running into. And the challenges that an entrepreneur usually has to undergo is that alignment that you spoke to before. Is the alignment matching the alignment of, and what is that money attached to? And so when we were talking about, I would take, if it has no strings attached to it, I would take money from just about anybody and use it for the right reasons. But you know, you look at like some of these big incubator accelerator programs, the Rocky Mountain Institute, for example, does some really great work. It's funding a lot of really great things. But who are the funders? Well, it's oil companies, essentially. It's extractive industry that's funding that, and there are strings attached to those funds, right? And so we got to be understanding of what it is. That and I mean, you've taken money, you mentioned, from Buffett's funds, right? He has all sorts of different strings attached to some of his money that works with investors and whatnot that aren't as good, and but it doesn't mean that those funds can't be good. I think it comes down to right alignment in a lot of ways, right? Can you find the right alignment and find the commonality of what, you know, even an oil company wants to see clean water and clean air, and because their family needs that just as much as anybody else does as well, right? And everybody needs that. So there can be even right alignment within extractive industry, I think, for them to transition away from I look at it as a hospice situation. How can they die off gradually and nicely in such a way, or transition their business models towards something that allows their other parts of the business to die off? Is that something that they want to do? I don't know, because of the financial incentives. The alignment isn't quite there yet. I think there's so much money out there that if we were just to see small tweaks in alignment, it would open up to a lot of the regenerative work that we're trying to do. So I'm curious, Joe, I guess the kind of question is, beyond philanthropy money, and also just within, do you see any of those structures working for the funding that you're doing right now? And I think I've seen you talk with like Blue Dot, which does Eduardo does a lot of, he does philanthropy, but he also does investment in so I'm wondering if you've maybe considered how to use other types of funding in your projects as well, besides philanthropy.
Yeah, I wanted to just show a project that emerged that moves in the direction of something that is like a business that can have the flow, the business model flow. But that required some of this, what I would call public goods infrastructure, where basically the philanthropic money created things that are public goods. They're things that are just generally good for the community. They're not privatized and they're of general benefit. And so this is a project I'm going to show right now called SUNA. And here's SUNA. And SUNA is a way that people can come to Barichara for 2 months. And so is it loading? No, it's not loading for some reason. Yes, that page isn't working. That link, there we go. Where someone can come for 2 months and they can learn lots of different things in the community and have a customized experience in regenerative processes. And the reason that this is an interesting example, look at the kinds of projects that there are, that, Agua Santa is a regenerative farm. El Totumo, they're doing syntropic agroforestry and watershed restoration. This is another more like an agroforestry community farm. This is where they do community healing and indigenous plant medicine ritual practices. And I could go on, but you start to see that the idea here is that someone could pay money to come and have an educational experience in Barichara because local projects are organized. And the local projects were organized through some of the earlier work that we were doing with philanthropic money, which is that we started mapping local projects. We started bringing them into collaboration. We started understanding their needs and then supporting them. And then this couple, Felipe and Alejandra, came along and said, well, what if we package that as a 2-month immersion for young people between the ages of 20 and 25 to teach them regenerative livelihoods? And they would pay $2,000 a month and they would come and do that. And the costs are lower, so there's actually a profit. So it's like a for-profit business selling a learning program. And the learning program came about because of the previous work in mapping and organizing what's happening in the community. So while they're not generating very much revenue right now, and they're still prototyping the logistics of it, we had our first 2 people come and we'd spent 2 months finding them housing and connecting them with processes, but we're learning. And you can see that it's a process improvement eventually. They're going to have a really good offering. And this would be a great way for young people to come and pay money for what is a version of regenerative tourism / regenerative education. And it can be done as a for-profit business. So I just want to show this as a developmental sequence. You can start with philanthropic investment, primarily philanthropic, and build capacities that eventually an entrepreneur like Felipe will say, well, I could create a regenerative business by offering an education program, and then I could support my family with it. And they did that because of the work that was happening, funded by the philanthropic money. So the lesson here is that your commercial ecosystem or your business ecosystem is growing from the infrastructure that is in the commons. And the infrastructure in the commons can be extracted from for private gain, like an unethical business might do, or it can also become a conduit for value flow into the community to support the livelihood of a family who's doing good in the community. And then it becomes like a family business. And you can see the same logic would apply to other kinds of business activities. But I just want to show that example as something that's in process. They're still figuring out how to make it a business. But they've already had their first 2 rounds of people enroll in it because they started earlier this year. And so this is one of the lessons about regenerative economics and the development of a regenerative economy, is that extractive economies have very little commons left in them. It's mostly been privatized and extracted. And so you have to restore some of the commons. And one element of that is what this concept called a public good. A public good is something you invest in that's just of general benefit to everyone in the community. And so having knowledge of the local regenerative projects is a public good if it's commonly known in the community. It's potentially like a trade secret or a private good if one person or a small group has access to that knowledge that they could capitalize on, that they could generate a business. But in both cases, they could be doing good for the community. So just recognizing that philanthropic investment can create public goods, and those public goods can become the basis for regenerative business. Whereas it's really hard to create a regenerative business if you don't have public goods in place, or if you don't have commons in place. So depending on where you are, what your local place is like, you may depend entirely on philanthropic money at the beginning because you actually need to build those public goods. Or it might be that you already have a mixed culture, like you have really good local government and public expenditures and lots of good nonprofits and lots of good philanthropy. And then you can actually create regenerative businesses because you're already there. You're already sort of mature enough in the developmental process. But I wanted to show that so that the other forms of investment can come in, but when they come in depends on how developed your capacities are for regenerative economy. David, please.
Yeah, I just revisited Guy Dauncey, who's on Vancouver Island, who's, you've probably heard of him, he's written The Economics of Happiness and promoting smallholder agriculture as way more productive than any kind of industrial agriculture. Brian, I don't know if you run into him.
Yeah, I met him in Nanaimo once when I
Oh
was
yeah, okay, well there you go.
Fox, yeah.
So we got to bring him into the design school then. Anyway, but because he's a great resource, he's got just bubbling over with ideas and projects, and it seems to be effective. He's working at a policy level as well as on the ground. Yeah, good. Well, I'm glad you met him.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. So Joshua, does that sort of point see how I'm not answering your question in knowledge, or I'm answering the question in process? It's like there are processes in which it can emerge.
Yeah, no, and I definitely see that, and I see the potential there, and I'm also wondering if what would be, because when you get to a certain point, it really isn't the most regenerative financing to take from philanthropy the entire time, but you do have to build up a commons, right? And there has to be something there, and I think really philanthropy money has that great ability to do that because it's non-dilutive. It's helping you to really establish things that can't even be commercialized until the commons is built, right? And so you're getting to that point, and then I'm also recognizing and just seeing micro lending and other kind of pieces, so that might be another instrument that comes in maybe right behind something in a once you set up a commons or something, where that could potentially be where a community is now you're creating funds or creating for-profit businesses that are running and thriving, regenerative businesses that are thriving. And in that community, they can actually pull back into and create lending structures that help to fund further progress. So I'm just wondering how we can get, maybe allow for more sophistication and diversity in the funding pool without destroying what you're kind of creating and extracting from it, getting a bad lender in or a bad funder in. And yeah, so I'm just trying to see which one, Brian, if you know Brian von Herzen, the Climate Foundation, have you run into his work with marine permaculture? He's been trying to solve this for a little while too, because he is trying to commercialize marine permaculture work, and it's going to cost a lot of money. A lot of times more than what philanthropy is willing to give into for a certain amount. But he's used a lot of philanthropy money to start commercializing towards other types of funding, and he's received multiple different types of funding structures. So I think that's another case study that we can possibly use here of is there maybe a possible progression towards having a larger, getting away from philanthropy at a certain point, because it is entirely at a certain point is not regenerative if that's all we can get is money that's coming in from and there's that's only the capital flow is only going one way, and it has to be kind of spreading a give and receive back and forth in a lot of ways for a thriving local economy, right? So I'm wondering if there's a thought or even progression that way.
I mean, one thing is that people giving philanthropic money is not only one form of capital flowing one way, it's financial capital flowing one way, and social capital, inspirational capital, knowledge capital, ecological capital that are flowing in other ways. Just want to name that. But that's just a comment, because I want to maybe just say, first, I want to recognize the time, and I'd like to have a chance for us to do a closing circle before we close. So I'll be very brief and say there's already a lot of work happening in Barichara around time banks, community funding structures, alternative currencies. There's a lot of that other stuff happening. I was describing the sources of money that had come in from the outside. But I just want to give one brief example of a non-financial exchange, or at least a non-monetary exchange that started to occur within the school Sueños del Bosque, which is when we were doing the vacation time, when the kids were out of school and in the other schools, and we had this community activity to invite more families to participate, to get to know the school. One of the things we wanted was more kids to experience what our school is. And so there was a price for parents to pay to put their kids, like, it's during summer, it's during a vacation, and you pay for a vacation program for your kids. So there's like a business model there. But then we had some campesino kids that the families wanted to put their kids in, but they don't have any money. They had less money. And so we offered that people could pay money, or they could do a value exchange to support the school. So we had a campesino family that wanted their son to be in the school, and they didn't have any money, but the father was a farmer, and so he came and did some gardening improvement work at the school. And it was just like, well, you can do other things that are valuable. You don't have to bring money. But we didn't want to make it free, because we didn't want people to take advantage of it and not value it. And also we wanted it to be respectable work, in a sense, like the teachers are doing something really valuable. It should be respectable. And of course, the campesino family that brought their son, they really valued it, but they just didn't have any money. And so because we're already funding the school with philanthropy, and then starting to create a business model with those who can afford to pay, we're we're moving toward the ability to offer scholarships or these exchanges that don't involve money. And that becomes part of the local economy. The non-monetary part is still part of the economy. And so, so that's just a small example, but a small example of the principle, which is when you create a relational context where the people are relating to each other in a way that you can give the option of a non-monetary exchange, then you have a real economy that expands to include the value of those things that are not monetary. And a lot of it is building that relational context. So, so it just reinforces that point again. So I know that we're 2 minutes from our scheduled closing time, which is a very brief closing time. So I want to just allow room to breathe if we go 3 minutes over or something. But I'd love to just do a round of sort of closing reflections for today. And I'll say one of the things that is a motivation for me in hosting these sessions is I do want to mobilize more money into Barichara. I want to help that to happen. There are some things that still need that philanthropic support. And at the same time, I feel the way that we're all exploring this together is so rich for what we're trying to do at the design school. And I'm very happy with where we're going right now. This conversation feels very rich and very educational. And like for all of us, we're all learning here, and just feels really good. And so I guess that's my checkout maybe. And then I'll pass it over to someone to continue, and we can do a round. So maybe David, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Yes, so for me, this has been a little insight into this other world. But, it made me think, well, okay, so what will we do here in Toronto with, I don't know, a certain amount of money? And I think we have to have a clear image of what we would do before we could even think about receiving it. So with that, I'll pass it to Brian.
I want to thank Joe. Thank you, David. And thank everybody. A lot of food for thought. There's a lot of things percolating in my head, different avenues I want to explore on this topic. And thank you for the inspiration and the knowledge to take the next step forward in those those directions. I'll pass it to Joshua.
Yeah, no, that there's a lot showing up for me. It was helping me to maybe possibly see progression of financial capital um, ways to still create regenerative economy, but also, yeah, looking at the other forms of capital, adding and contributing, and even though it's really hard to track that, it is something that needs to be included in a regenerative economy for sure. And maybe there are better ways that we could even understand the flow and give and receive of those other capitals as we learn and develop how to create bioregional regenerative economies. And I'll pass it over to Joan.
Joshua. I'm so much more hopeful. Thank you, everyone. And I love what you said, Joshua. The value of the other non-monetary flows in the economy, and finding ways to do accounting for that part as well. I'll pass it to Maria Elena.
Sorry, unmuting on a phone is not always easy. Yeah, no, thank you very much. The thing that really struck me in all of this discussion is the place that you gave to trust in your fundraising processes, and therefore to relationships. So yeah, that just really struck me, how important relationships are and were in your processes. So thank you for that. I apologize for not being able to take part very much. I had some things going on around me, had to deal with, but thank you. It's been very informative. I'll pass to Ricardo.
Thank you, Marilena, and thank you, everyone here. It's a very rich conversation, and on my side, very encouraged to keep on learning on storytelling and going, and write and tell the story of the place and the story of the people I'm getting involved with. So thanks a lot. I pass it over to Julie.
Oops, you're muted.
There we go. I thought gaining capacity for Regenerate Cascadia or Northwest Permaculture Convergence, two main organizations I'm involved in, had to do with relationships and trust and a unified vision. And I still think that because if you don't have that, I mean, thank you for the visual. Thank you for the vision of you start with that, and then the resources come, and then there's building the commons, the common good, and then from that is where you get the abundance, like from the seeds, as Mike would say. The exponential abundance. So it's good to be in touch with so many people that are so if not having manifested, at least seeing the vision of how it works. I'm still in the building trust and healing the harms phase. in my circles. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here and a part of this.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, everyone. You can really see how regenerative finance is similar to trophic flow in an ecosystem, which is the flow of energy and nutrients between the bodies of the organisms. That a regenerative finance system is not primarily about money, although money is one of the ways of representing energy that is flowing in the system. And so I'm really excited to see what bubbles up, you know, when we come back together here in 2 weeks, or just in any other moment of connection between us. How are we cultivating the soil of relationship and trust among us here for whatever the shared vision may be in its articulations? There'll be different moments with different expressions, and that our ability to relate to each other in that sense of shared vision and trust is really, as you said, Julie, it's not only compelling, it actually works. You know, it is what works. And then there are lots of other ways to do it in the mechanisms and the tools and the models, but this is such a foundational element, this focus on relationships, trust, and shared vision. And then realizing that we have resources available, like was said, that even $5 can be something that makes a meaningful difference. That, you know, meaning it's not the size of the action, it's that the action is based in love, and that it's received with gratitude. And you can see the wisdom traditions just speaking through there. And I feel a lot of gratitude today for this conversation. So thank you all very much. And we'll see you all soon. Have a beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Gracias.
Thank you, Joe. Good to see everybody.